Hello. Thanks for tuning in to our Fruit Juice Matters webinar. This webinar is supported by the British Fruit Juice Association. My name is Dr. Sarah Jarvis. I'm a GP, Clinical Director of Patient.info and a medical broadcaster. But first and foremost, I'm a GP, have been for 27 years. And I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Johan Rycker, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Information and Communication Sciences in Brussels. The Fruit Juice Matters initiative is directed towards healthcare professionals to communicate the facts and the science supporting the health benefits associated with drinking fruit juice in line with recommended portion size. Everything we're saying is in line with national recommendations, and really we're here to let the facts get in the way of a good headline. Because let's face it, there is a huge amount of confusion among our patients about whether fruit juice, pure fruit juice, has any place in a healthy diet. We all know that pure fruit juice contains sugars, but it's also got many other nutrients that are important for health. And when consumed in the correct portion size of 150 ml once a day, fruit juice does make a nutritious contribution to a balanced diet. So Professor Rycker and I are hoping to recalibrate the debate and provide some of the evidence that supports the nutritional benefits of fruit juice and help you in answering your patients' questions with scientifically supported answers. Professor Rycker will also be taking us through the scientific evidence of what's been termed the fructose hypothesis. That's the theory that too much fructose, one of the sugars specifically in fruit and fruit juice, is a particular culprit in the rise in obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease and metabolic syndrome. So, Johan, let's start with the fructose hypothesis. Not sure people are going to be familiar with it as a concept, but I think they'll probably understand when you start explaining how it's been couched.
Well, basically, fructose is one of those sugars that is in the liver changed into quite a lot of other things. And one of those things is that it gets transformed into fats. Now, rat studies will confirm that about 60 to 70% of your fructose is turned into fat. Human beings, however,
are not rats.
And they actually transform less than 1%. So there is a beginning of confusion already in that.
Do you think that's where part of this may have come from, this particularly targeting, this particular blame game?
Well, I mean, when we're talking obesity, etc., we're talking about sugars making you fat.
Yeah.
So
they do in excess.
They do, absolutely. Now, the other thing about the research is that if you look at those studies where fructose has been compared to a similar amount of other sugars, then there's virtually no effects. But if you look at those fructose studies where up to 250 grams per day in pure fructose are given.
Okay, let's compare that with the amount of fructose in, say, a 150 ml portion of orange juice.
7.5 grams.
Okay.
Okay. So we're talking about 250 to 7.5.
Yep.
And then we will see some effects like diabetes, like
Type 2 diabetes.
Type 2 diabetes, indeed, and cardiovascular effects, etc.
But if you think about the number of calories involved in 250 grams of sugar of any description, then we're talking about a significant impact on obesity. And we know, every healthcare professional knows, that obesity is associated with type 2 diabetes, heart attack, hypertension and stroke.
Absolutely. So that is where the first confusion is. We need to get back to base, need to look back at those studies and see what they are really telling us. Yeah. What we're seeing now is that there is emerging evidence that if you take fructose in its normal kind of dosage, 150 ml, 7.5 gram of fructose a day, then there are actually reduced risks with things like hypertension, with things like cardiovascular disease mortality, and with stroke mortality.
Now, is that 7.5, so it's a tiny gram, a tiny dose, if you like, of fructose, which is what we're seeing in this one portion of juice. But do you see the same thing? You know, is there a U-shaped
There
curve?
is actually, yes, absolutely. There is a, so you have what is called catalytic doses,
Right.
which is about between 7 and 10 grams of fructose. If you then go to about 17 to 25% energy coming from fructose, then we have a problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, and of course what we're seeing with so many of our patients is whether it's in the form of sucrose, glucose, fructose, our patients are having all those sugar-sweetened drinks,
Yeah.
nectars, juice drinks, completely different. So many of my patients get confused between, they think they're having juice because it says juice drink.
No, we're really, because we can see a difference between fruit drinks,
Yep.
yeah, and between 100% pure fruit juice.
Okay. Okay. Let's move on then, if we may, just to the sugar element of it.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about the sugar in fruit juice?
Well, the sugar in fruit juice is you have fructose, you have glucose, and you have sucrose, and they will vary according to whether it's orange juice or apple juice, etc. But we're talking about more or less 10 grams per 100 milliliters.
And what you're effectively saying, it doesn't matter whether it's fructose, glucose, sucrose. Yes, fruit juice does have free sugar, but it's not added sugar.
No, it isn't added sugar. So because the official definition of fruit juice is that you cannot add sugar. It's not a recipe where you can put in or take out. It is squeezing your fruits into juice.
But we have to be honest about this because, you know, we do now have a Public Health England message of 150 mils. It only counts as 1 of your 5 a day, no matter how many you have. So tell me about that in the context of sugar.
Well, in the context of sugar, you actually, your 150 mils is probably representing about 4% energy of your total daily energy intake. You have to be careful with sugar anyway, but I would think that looking at the hierarchy of things to leave out, maybe we should start with sugar-sweetened beverages, with cookies and chocolates and so on. And then, if you then still have a problem, okay, be careful with fruit juice. But 150 ml normally, with all the research that we're beginning to see, is actually tracking quite nicely, or at least what we know is no harm.
Okay. So we've got about 4% of your average calorie intake, or the calorie intake you need, comes from one 150 ml portion. That does contain free sugar, not added sugar. And presumably that's the reason that Public Health England recommends that we have it with meals to reduce damage to the teeth.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, as all sugars, as all fermentable sugars, you will have dental caries potential if you don't brush your teeth twice a day with a fluoride type toothpaste.
Okay.
It's simple.
Sure. And what about spikes in blood sugar after drinking fruit juice on an empty stomach, for instance?
When we're getting to that 7.5 grams of fructose or something like that, those initial spikes will actually almost kickstart your glucose metabolism and so on.
So that's, natural production then. Okay.
The thing is also, what we see more and more research is that actually if you follow the recommendations of Diabetes Society, etc., so the 150 ml and so on, then you see that quite a lot of meta-analyses on diabetes and fruit juice are coming out saying there is no problem with fasting blood glucose, with fasting blood insulin, with the homeostatic model of assessment for insulin resistance, or with glycated hemoglobin. So you have all those indicators or markers of diabetes where there's no problem.
So of course those are predispositions to diabetes, therefore it's only type 2 diabetes.
Only type 2 diabetes.
But what about people with diabetes, whether type 1 or type 2, and whether they can have fruit juice?
Provided that their portions are well controlled and fall under you know, a maximum of 150 ml.
And presumably provided they take that into account in terms of their carbohydrates.
Absolutely.
If they're carb counting.
Yes, yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Okay. So that's the negative side, the potential negative side. We're not for a second suggesting there is no sugar in fruit juice.
No.
However, it has, you know, it's relatively small
Yes.
in the great scheme of things. But of course, there's also the benefits. So what about the
Absolutely.
nutrients in fruit juice?
Well, for a start, you have fruit juice, 100% recommended daily allowance of vitamin C.
Yep.
And it is a very good source of folate and potassium. And probably some of the reasons why we're seeing some of those protective effects in cardiovascular or cardiometabolic risks may well have something to do with the fact that it is a good source of potassium.
Yeah. We're increasingly seeing actually the ACC, the American Conference of Cardiology, looking at potassium, at increasing your potassium intake. That's quite interesting. Now, one of the things it doesn't contain, but I find a real issue for my younger female patients in particular, it doesn't contain iron, but it improves absorption, doesn't it?
Exactly. Vitamin C is actually making heme iron more bioavailable. So if you drink a glass of fruit juice together with your steak, you will actually absorb more of the iron that is there than if you would do it otherwise.
I'm increasingly seeing in my surgery young women in particular, but actually all across, and then the elderly population who simply are not getting enough iron in their diet. I think an analysis coming from the NDNS, the National Diet and Nutrition Survey, showed that about 30% of women, even if they were eating some red meat, were not getting enough iron, and that figure goes up to about 40% were not getting enough iron. So particularly in those groups where they actually need iron, which of course it's all of us, but I'm thinking particularly maybe elderly people who don't absorb as well, elderly people whose nutrition is less good, and young women.
But in a way it answers also your question of having your fruit juice together with something else.
Absolutely.
With a meal.
Which
so,
of course is the recommendation.
Yes.
So we're absolutely going with that. Fantastic. Okay. So phytonutrients lastly, just before we move on.
Phytonutrients, don't forget that there's about more than 5,000 phytonutrients in fruits and vegetables. So there's no single silver bullet that is going to solve everything. But the thing is that actually if we look at some of the recent research is that things like hesperidin, naringenin, lutein, beta-cryptozanthine, quercetin are more bioavailable in fruit juice actually than in fruit.
Okay, whoa, I'm going to stop you there.
No.
I am not going to suggest that anybody watching this tells their patients to drink juice instead of eating fruit, but I take your point.
The point being actually that all those phytonutrients, even if you pasteurize fruit juice, aren't going to go away. On the contrary, they're there.
Actually, that's a really important point from the point of view of particularly patients in socioeconomically deprived areas who may have problems getting fresh fruit, maybe have problems affording fresh fruit. Because actually, cartoned fruit juice, you're saying basically, is pretty much as good.
Yes, yes.
Okay, so this is good. This is all good, clean stuff.
This is, you know, watch this space. This is recent research set in motion also with the Fruit Juice Matters campaign, financing research and setting that whole research program in motion will take time, but several of those articles have either been published or just submitted and are under peer review. So, you know, I would say watch this space.
Fantastic. Johan, thank you so much.
Thank you.
There, I think it's fair to say you have it. Firstly, fruit juice is not a replacement for fruit. But interestingly, that's not the way people are using it. And in fact, the NDNS, the National Diet and Nutrition Survey from Public Health England, showed that people who were consuming fruit juice were actually 42% more likely to be meeting their 5-a-day target than people who weren't. So they're not using it as a replacement. I think we can reassure ourselves when we give patients in that advice. The simple fact of the matter is that people in the UK are just not achieving their 5 a day. So if we're going to be giving messages out there about reducing the sugar in our diets, and of course there are very, very many reasons for recommending it, I would strongly suggest that we go with Johan's suggestion and ask people to focus first on the cookies, the sugary drinks, the fizzy drinks. In other words, not focus on fruit juice, which may result in us throwing the baby out with the bathwater. As for the figures about obesity and the fructose hypothesis and all this idea that fructose specifically is to blame for type 2 diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, you name it, it causes it, well, apparently not. Interestingly, an analysis of 6 years' worth of NDNS data shows that fruit juice drinkers on average had a lower body mass index and a lower waist circumference. So really, really important. In terms of concentrate, I think that's a very important message. I work in a fairly deprived area, and it's really important for me to be able to say to my patients, look, the simple fact of the matter is, as long as it is pure fruit juice and not a fruit juice drink, not a nectar, not a squash, then it will have the same nutritional content as the deeply posh, deeply expensive, and, all right, deeply tasty, freshly squeezed version. And then finally, really important public health message about oral hygiene. The simple fact of the matter is that in an ideal world, you should be consuming your fruit juice after or with food, and about half an hour or more later, you should either brush your teeth or, if you can't do that, at least rinse your mouth. I think I've covered everything. Pretty good summary. Really, it has been a pleasure for me to talk with Professor Johan de Rycker, who, frankly, has forgotten more about the science since breakfast than I've ever known. But my job was to put it into English. Professor, thank you so much.